My large classes were mainly introduction to anthropology, as everybody has to take a turn, and some teaching. I taught a course called One World, Many Peoples, and something like that at Waterloo, which was a kind of comparative development course, I guess. But the courses that I loved were methods, a third-year methods course by the time I got to York University, and I taught some of that at Waterloo, and also courses on place and space, and I did a lot of graduate teaching at first at McMaster. I taught between the end of my postdoc for a year before I got my job at York at McMaster, and taught methods courses there. And the approach to methods, I think, kind of conveys what my overall interest in teaching is. It was such a joy to support students to come from sheer terror about what they were going to do their fieldwork on, or sheer grandiosity about what they were going to do their fieldwork on. It seemed to be one or the other. To a confidence that they could plan for whatever happened. So I strongly encouraged planning and then letting go, holding that, what I would now say is holding that lightly, because whatever you plan is sure to change. But to be able to plan it, to see it, to have it all laid out in almost like it was the outline for the dissertation or the thesis before you go to the field and then start changing it around. So I saw it as a way of supporting or empowering students to think for themselves, gather the resources that they needed with guidance, look critically at the questions of the day, to choose their theoretical framework and their methodological approach, and then to focus on the ethnography. I remember Matt Cooper saying to me once that, probably more than once, that it was the ethnography that would last. And I thought in the 70s that was not true, that the ethnography people were missing out on all of the exciting theory of structural anthropology and symbolic anthropology and Levi-Straussian analysis and all of this. And in fact, now I see that for many of us, it's a question of reading through the theory that obscures the ethnography to get back to, well, what was it that actually happened there? So I appreciate the ethnography in a way that I never did in my own graduate school, but I certainly have encouraged my students to focus on that. Maybe I'll talk a bit more about just the career, if that's right, the teaching and that sort of thing right now, and then I can talk about the substance of the work. My graduate, I got a job at York University in 1986 and began working with graduate students immediately there, and I ended up being the principal supervisor for 9 PhD dissertations that completed. I still have one out there too that I'm hopeful one day will finish, but I haven't yet. And I served on many other committees. And I can't tell you how many master's students. They were all dear to me at the time. But my first master's student was Rosalind Morris, who went on to become a symbolic anthropologist, or a happening anthropologist at Columbia University. So what a gift that was. And Maria Inés Arratia, a Chilean woman who was older than I was my first supervision at the PhD level. And she brought a wealth of experience in development in Chile and was working with the Aymara. So I supervised people in areas that I knew nothing about, and also a handful of students who went with me or alone to Vanuatu. Notably, Jean Mitchell, who is now at the University of Prince Edward Island and did extensive fieldwork in Black Sands outside of Port Vila. And also Daniela Kramer, who did a master's with me and is now finished her PhD at the LSE and is at the University of Toronto. They bracketed these students. And in between, Alexandra Widmer, Maggie Cummings, who else? This is going to get me in trouble now. Doug Campbell, who is still in progress. Maggie is teaching at the University of Toronto. Both she and Sandra Widmer have gone back and done further field work. And I may have to ask you to edit in whoever I've forgotten here, but there were others. And also I supervised one PhD student who did her research on housing cooperatives at the time that I was doing research on housing cooperatives. We were able to get funding for these students through SSHRC grants, which was connected to research projects that I was doing at the time. And I really regret that it's so much harder now to fund doctoral research, especially doctoral research that's independent of a supervisor's research. Because for those who went out on their own, it was such a wonderful opportunity to do their own work and to be free and in responding to what happened in the field and to focus the studies where they were drawn to focus them. At the University of Waterloo, I was able to get, while I was there, I got a grant from the University of Waterloo and from SSHRC. I don't think it was a major research grant, to go back to Vanuatu. And I did that fieldwork in 1982. It was a joint project with Jean-Marc Philibert, who was at the University of Western Ontario. He had done fieldwork in Arikor Lagoon near Port Vila in Vanuatu. And we'd had conversations about doing a study of consumer behavior in both Arikor, which was a Francophone community, and in Longano, which was an Anglophone community. Arikor was a peri-urban settlement. Longano was very rural. And just to look and see, we did work with school children. Word association, Pierre Miranda had introduced us to that idea. And word associations for school children around, what does work mean to you? What is an office? What's hard? What's easy? And so on. It was a small project. Not much ever came of it. I think we had 1 or 2 publications out of it. But it was an opportunity to go back to Vanuatu yet again. So that was in 1982. And shortly thereafter, it wasn't possible to go to Vanuatu. So that was very important that we had been able to go back at that time. The consumption study had introduced me to new kinds of methods that I frankly didn't use much after that. And the method that I taught when I was teaching content rather than coaching people to do their field work, and a lot of my methods courses at the graduate level were, I think, more support group coaching sessions than training in a particular methodology, because there were many, right? But the one that I see now that I developed over the whole body of work was one that involved a conversation between place and people, place and the movement of people, place and the stories that they told, place and power, place and conflict. And so it was a grounded theory, if you like. Glaser and Strauss were very influential on my early training. That and that systems thinking, David Easton, political science system thinking, Gregory Bateson's work, that they grounded some of it ecological. You see this? What's that? Ask them. Ask again. The curiosity to keep checking back with people, which feeds into any kind of good communication, of course. So the mapping, I would get information from, in my dissertation, I would get information from one source and I would check it with somebody else, not giving the names, but of course they knew. And there would be discussions in our house with this map of, his line's over here. No, it's over here. But it gave people a chance to actually see things in a way that they hadn't, because it was done onto aerial photographs, in a way that they hadn't before, and have conversations, and those were very enlightening. So that methodology, it underpinned my dissertation and what then became the book that came out of the dissertation. It involves some quantification always. I had used computers early and often, and the theory flowed more from the methodology than anything else. It was a praxis, if you like, or a practical approach. Phenomenology, it was an important thread in it, mostly insofar as it influenced how people construct space. The method of looking at place and people started with a dissertation and my 1987 book, Masters of Tradition. It also led me into later research, which I will be talking about, on colonial housing, a place and space in co-ops, housing co-ops, and back into the work that I did with settlers who were born in Vanuatu, mixed-race families that lived in Vanuatu, and into the work with house girls. That was my last book. So there's this thread around a praxis approach, grounded approach to looking at built form and landscape for clues about how people, the culture of space, if you like, how people create a culture and represent that culture in their built forms. The social construction of space, if you like. I should back up, because I'm going to skip something here if I don't. To 1982, I had gone to Vanuatu, and in 1985, as I finished teaching a sabbatical, covering a sabbatical replacement at McMaster, had no job prospects. It was almost as bad in the Reagan years in terms of employment as it is for students today trying to get jobs. It actually wasn't as bad because there was a strong market for replacements, short-term replacements that actually had benefits. And there were, when there were jobs, they were more likely to be tenure track, and there wasn't this large cadre of contract faculty. But it was still tough. Not too tough because I had a husband who was on salary at McMaster. But while I was teaching that sabbatical replacement, I applied to SSHRC for a research grant, which you could do at that time, and sometimes you've been able to since, for an independent scholar to do fieldwork. So I picked a topic that I would never have picked had there not been a moratorium on expatriate fieldwork in Vanuatu at the time. In 1985, and for 9 years thereafter, Vanuatu was independent by this time. It had been independent in 1980. So when we went back in 82, it was the first time since independence. And in 1985, the Cultural Center, which was the gatekeeper for all researchers, over non-Indigenous researchers, looked around and they said, we don't have any Indigenous researchers here. It's time we closed the doors to the expatriates and trained Indigenous fieldworkers. So they did that, and there was a certain antipathy to foreign researchers at that time, for other reasons. And they began a training program led by Professor Darrell Tryon from a New Zealander with the Australian National University, who came in and worked with Kirk Huffman, who was the curator of the Cultural Center, to bring in men from all around the islands who had an interest in learning how to record their own culture and customs, and how to do publications based on that. So, and to collect artifacts as well, because they were creating, the Cultural Center already had some artifacts and they wanted to collect more. So over that 9-year period, Darrell began that training program and it was hugely successful. during that period, if one wanted, and it's a career question too. Here, your reputation is in, I'm an ethnographer specializing in Vanuatu, but I can't go there, and I don't know for how long. At some point, we knew when it was going to end, but for a long time we didn't, or if it would ever end. And so, what was I going to do? So I was in conversation with CUSO, it used to be Canadian University Service Organization, I believe, but latterly known by the acronym CUSO. And I think they had invited Bill and me to come to Ottawa to train some volunteers who were going to Vanuatu, because they could send expatriate volunteers. And some of those volunteers were working in fisheries. So, knowing absolutely nothing about fisheries, except I used to catch fish as a kid, and I liked boats. I'd always liked sailing. I applied to Sooke and got a grant to study CUSO involvement in village fisheries development in Vanuatu. It was to do an evaluation, and they also wanted me to do an evaluation of their village fisheries development project. So I did it under contract, part of it under contract with CUSO, and part of it for Sooke. It was a very interesting opportunity to do applied research, which another thread that I want to note is that I was always most comfortable doing fieldwork that I thought had practical applicability to the people I was working with. This one did, for sure. I had a very good working relationship with CUSO and with their volunteers, and they provided a house for me and my family to live in. And by then we had, our little girl was 5 and our son would have been 13, and my husband, and we lived in a village on the island of Santo. It was a French Catholic village called Port Olry. I always say that wrong because they always called it Port Laurie, but Port Olry. And we did half the research there and half in Longana, where there was also a village fisheries development project. The theory was development theory, really. It was a question of looking to see who benefits from this project. Does anybody benefit from the project? Who doesn't? What are the issues that arise? It was very much a evaluation, research-based detective work. It gave us the opportunity to live in the most beautiful setting I have ever lived in, and where you're filming today is the other most beautiful setting I have ever lived in, also overlooking the sea here in British Columbia, but that one was on a beach that I will give you a picture of, that was the powdery white sand, turquoise water lagoon, beautiful for swimming, and palm trees, and some very nice people, and some people who were just a pain in the butt. It was such a difficult piece of fieldwork. There is a saying that anthropologists get the people they deserve, and I would think that, except all the other people I've had the privilege of working with have been lovely. I think that what happened was that we stepped into an ongoing political and linguistic and religious conflict. So we were living in a house that had been built for the previous CUSO volunteers, and that part of the village belonged to the only Anglophone Presbyterians in the area who controlled the fishing venture. And that wasn't real clear until we got there. And somebody said, yeah, we were going to burn down that house when the other people were living here. So I had, fortunately, a woman working with me named Pascaline, who was Francophone Ni Vanuatu from one of the 2 linguistic groups in that village, the minority side. But she had family on the other side too. She was as well positioned as anybody could have been to support this project. And one day, we were not getting anywhere. No one would talk to me, except the Presbyterians who were running the fishing project. And he was nervous because I wanted to see the books, to see what kind of fish were they catching and how many and blah, blah, blah. What was their catch return and stuff. Because you didn't have to know a lot about fish to know what you needed to look for, right? So he didn't want to give me his books because he was concerned that I would reveal something about his bookkeeping practice, where the money was going, who knows what, that he didn't want revealed. So that wasn't going very well. And one day, Pascaline and I walked down along the beautiful sand beach, as we did all the time. I think my daughter was with us because that always seemed to help, a little 5-year-old kid. And we approached 3 or 4 fishermen who were sitting on their canoes talking. They were talking. And when we got there, they shut up. And she asked them some questions in the local language. And they just looked out to sea. And I asked them some questions in Bislamon. And they just looked out to sea. And I said, Pascaline, long, Ogeta. She says, what's going on? She says, they don't want to talk to you. I said, I can see that. It's very clear, right? And so we were at a turning point in the research. And I concluded that I would have to get stronger in order to find out whether anybody would talk to me. And maybe they wouldn't, and maybe I would just have to do what I was already by then telling my students to do and reformulate the research on the fly. It was always, I could go to Longana because I knew I could do it there. But I decided to take a chance. And so with my daughter, Pascaline didn't want to have any part of this next part. She's in the shade. And but with my daughter, I went down the main part of the village. It was a sand beach. And I mean, it was an inland, but the main street was all sand. And stood down the center of that village, and I said in a really loud voice, not an aggressive stance, because you have to know how to stand in Vanuatu. You never stand with your hands on your hips. But I stood with my hands behind my back, but I said, and women didn't speechify, but I was a white woman, it was different. And I said, I'm wondering why people don't want to talk to me. It's clear they don't want to talk to me. And I knew how to make a speech because I'd sat through all those long graded society ceremonies and weddings, right? So it had to be long, and we'll spare your viewers. But basically I said, maybe, because I'd heard a rumor to this effect, maybe some of you think that I have come to impose a tax on fish. Maybe some of you think that I'm going to tax every fish that comes ashore here, every fish that you want to sell. Well, and I heard somebody behind a door go, hear me out now. And I said, well, that's not true. And I'd like to have a conversation with anybody who would like to hear what the true story is. And one door opened. And it was an old fisherman named Boniface, bless his soul. And he came out and we had a conversation. And he asked a lot of questions. Old man with a big white beard. And I answered his questions. And at the end, he said, okay, I know some people who will talk. I will talk to you, and I know some people who will talk to you. And things opened up. And it was never easy. And I was always sure, or half sure, that somebody was going to burn down our house. But we had no violence against us, really nothing except the silent treatment that we continued to receive from some people. And I did the work, and I did it fast. I think it was about 6 weeks in that village. And got out. And and the pair Sacco, who was a Italian priest, but French-speaking Italian priest who was resident, was also very helpful with this. And he had served time on Tana, which was also what he did in a previous life to deserve Tana and then Santo. I don't know, because Tana was also a notoriously difficult place, especially to be a priest. It was a very there was a lot of people who wanted to adhere to custom and not come into the church at all, or government, and a lot of conflict. The conflict in Port Alry probably dated back to colonization. It certainly dated back to the eve of independence, when there had been a rebellion in Vanuatu. And this was only 5 years later. So I can see why it happened. I have compassion for those people's attitude, but it sure made my life easier that Boniface decided to open the door. And it's a lesson, I think, in persistence and field work, and also knowing when to fold your cards and get out of town. So I didn't have to get out of town on that, and I went to Longana, did some field work over there, got malaria, and put everything that I knew about fishing and QSO into this book, which is called Deep Water, and it, including the appendix, is 162 pages long. And that's it. And I'm sure I got some things wrong about the fishing part. But it was an interesting study for me, and I hope for readers, because the key question in it was, what is success, and for whom? Because development projects often measure success in terms of money generated, success for the donors, a success for the government, and increasingly now, success for local people. But at that time, that was rare. So I was looking at success for the participants, success for the non-participants. For many people, it made no difference. For nobody did it really do harm. But the main beneficiaries were the development industry itself. The people who became volunteers and went out there, the people who were exporting fresh snapper to Japan, which is no small trick in a country where there's very little refrigeration. So very well organized. Anyway, it was that sort of an impact study that I ended up writing. And it actually, I think, sold more copies. I think it sold 5,000 copies, which for my books was a bestseller. My son's gone on to be a novelist, and he's written some books for young adults that the first book he wrote sold more than 5,000 copies in the first 3 months. But for me, that was a satisfying book. I was pleased with it. So that's 1985. I wrote the book. So I did the fieldwork in the fall, and then I wrote the book at the Australian National University. So I'd like to add one more thing about the fieldwork in the fall of 85, or the northern fall of 85. In Vanuatu when we were in Port Albury and Longana. I didn't do any work on place names or anything to do with geography and anthropology. It would have been even more controversial than what I was doing. I didn't attempt to do a census, which I always did. I liked to go into a community and map it, and then come back years later and see how the houses all moved around. But I didn't do that in Port Albury because it was just, they were too likely to refuse me or worse. Yet I made some observations about community life there that were useful. I took pictures of all of the different house styles that they had, and I was able to use those pictures in Mbai to do evaluative research, photo elicitation research on what makes a good place to live. And so people loved this. They sat around with this deck of black and white photographs, pre-digital age, and they went through them and they sorted them. They did pile sorts for me. It was really fun about which ones were best. And I learned that there was one 2-story house in Port Albury, belonged to the fishing family project, surprise, surprise. In Longana, everybody looked at that and I couldn't sleep there. I'm not sleeping on the 2nd story of anything. They have earthquakes all the time in this part of Vanuatu. I remember my daughter as a 2-year-old bouncing out of our house. We had a bamboo floor in an earthquake. So no wonder. But it was for more than that. It just didn't feel like a place you could sleep in. And they went through cement houses and tin, corrugated iron houses and leaf houses, and by and large preferring the cement block houses to everything, even though I've always thought they were the worst choice. But they're sturdy. They don't have to be rebuilt every time a hurricane comes through. So that photo shoot was really helpful in a paper I did on what makes a house a good place to live, and also in work that I did later on the impact of a cyclone in Longana when they knocked down all of the houses and everything was rebuilt, and often with more permanent materials. But looking at what makes a place good. The other thing about Port Albury that stood out for me was that there were no flowers. And a lot of the yards were not broomed, not swept. And what makes a place a good community, a sign of a healthy community, in my experience in Vanuatu, in the rural areas, was that they there was grass and they cut it with bush knives. What backbreaking work that must have been. Or when they could afford it and had benzene, lawnmower. Or there was a bare swept earth, and it was kept bare swept. every day. Every leaf would be swept away, like some tourist resort. And there would be flowers. And there was great interest. We brought flower seeds with us. There was great interest in what would grow. This is how you get noxious weeds. But anyway, what would grow here? And could you get us can you get some flowers from here or there? And we'll try them. They would get flowers from the planters and try them out in the village and grow fruit trees. And Port Albury had none of that. They had a beautiful beach. That was it. So it led me to it opened my eyes to something I had taken for granted as part of a Ni Vanuatu community was bare swept earth and grass and flowers and no pigs running around. Well, sometimes. But Port Albury was not like that at all. We went to, had a holiday in New Zealand, rented a camper van which broke down in a national park over Christmas. And that turned out to be rather fun, actually. The children decorated a growing tree with whatever we happened to have in the camper van that we weren't wearing at the time. And then we came to the Australian National University where we'd been invited to spend, I think it was 6 months, arriving in January. There were a number of people who became important influences on my life who were at ANU. At the time, we were in the Research School of Pacific Studies. And Jerry Ward was there. And I later contributed to a book that he and one other person did on land tenure in the Pacific. But it was there that we got to know each other, and we talked about land issues. There was also Roger Keesing and Christine Jourdain. Were both there at that time. I remember Roger coming in from Paris, I think it was. And he, when I travel long distances like that, the overnight flight and it's late and I don't arrive all perky and like my shirt's still pressed. And he was always like that. And I remember him showing up at the office because, well, he still had some energy, It's like, really. And he was delightful. And we had many barbecues with him. And Joël Bonmaison and his family were there. They were neighbors of ours in Garin. It was a delightful time in my life. I always found Joël a great inspiration because he's such a... his geographical approach to Tano was so spirited, I guess you could say. It was all about the feel of the people and the land and the spiritual connection. It was a very spiritual geography that Joël practiced. And who else was there at that time? There's somebody else who will come to me. But those conversations with Roger, Christine, Joël, Jerry Ward were central to it. And they had a speakers series as well, so they had people coming up. Michael Allen came up from Sydney. It was such a lively place to be. And it was interdisciplinary, which I loved because I was, even then, a very interdisciplinary anthropologist. Sometimes my connection with geographers was closer than my connection with other anthropologists, with historians later. But their geography department was excellent as well. And they had an undergraduate school with other Pacific specialists. So it was such a great... Margaret Jolly was around. She was at Sydney, I think, but maybe not. And Nicholas Thomas had just arrived. And so it was very rich. And I discovered that there were other ways of asking questions in seminars than the Canadian way, which was always very cautious and polite, and usually said what they appreciated about your paper. And there, the question, well, first of all, they dared to have a coffee break after your talk, and people actually came back to ask, sat down again to ask the questions, which was great. Well, it was a great way to get people to take a break and think about it and then ask the questions. But I'm not sure it would have worked at our university. And they would begin with, "Thank you. The thing I find missing in your paper is..." And it would go from there. It was just ruthless, but not mean, just pointed. So it really sharpened my chops as a presenter and taught me not to take questions personally. Even though sometimes I'm sure they were intended personally, I chose not to do that. It was a ton of fun. And I had taken with me to the field in 1985, not to the rural field sites, but to Port Vila, a computer. It was state of the art for the time. It was a portable computer, which you might think is like this, but it was 44 pounds. It was my allowed weight on the airplane, and it was called a luggable, but at least they acknowledged that it wasn't really a portable computer. I think it was an Epson, not really sure. It had a kind of a yellow golden screen. And I did work in the statistics department, and the government of Vanuatu allowed me to keep it in their air-conditioned place, which was good because it really needed that. And I did a lot of statistical analysis there, looking at fisheries data, but also coconut data on coconut copra exports and price and so on, which then I was able to incorporate into the book about my dissertation. That came out of my dissertation, excuse me. That computer served me well at the ANU, and they provided one on loan for Bill. So we shared an office, and in about a couple of months, I wrote the book, which partly, as I say, was easy because it was everything I knew. It wasn't a question of what shall I use from this vast array of data. And it was partly easy because it was so clear what I wanted to say. I mean, I had done it in a very focused way, and it just flowed. And I read it. I mean, I wrote it to be used in classes. I was at that time teaching that course, what became One World, Many Peoples, on development, and I wanted to work it into my teaching, and I wanted it to be read by more than a couple hundred people. By then I was working as a series editor, a volunteer series editor for the Association for Social Anthropology in Oceania, ASAO. And, I saw their book sales, and I saw the value of having monographs that are not widely read or not widely purchased, probably widely read in libraries. But I wanted to write something that had a somewhat bigger audience. While I was writing the book, I was contacted. I don't think it was by email in those days, but it might have been. I don't think so, though, but it might have been. I remember using, I've got to put this in, computers. So I remember my first use of computers was that I could input on, that I didn't give to somebody to punch, was when I was on a postdoc at the University of Waterloo. And Dorothy Counts and I loved playing a computer game called Adventure. And the University of Waterloo was very savvy and way ahead of other places at the time in computing. So they had the weather report available by computer to everybody because they were largely windowless offices. And they had this access to this game called Adventure. And Dorothy and I enjoyed playing it. And they provided us with a terminal that we could have at home, each of us, so that we could message each other. And we could message each other and the office, and we could play Adventure. So then my nephew, who was a neuroscientist, recently gave me all of the early files of Adventure so that we could continue to play. I think it became quite visual at some point, but this time it was all text. So this that was the first analysis that I did on my own, was using that little luggable computer. And I may have received a message by computer, or it might have been by telephone, from Jerry Gold, who was the chair at York University at the time, the Anthropology department, inviting me to, paying my travel to come for an interview for a tenure track position that they were advertising. And I did that. I made the trip back. It was one of those ones, CP Air at the time. They no longer exist. There's a good reason for that. They were known for canceling their flights. And so I was delayed leaving, and I think it was 48 hours in transit, and I had to do a job interview. It was crazy. And the job interview was crazy, too. And at some point I remember hearing them say, oh, and we all teach our graduate courses for free on overload because we can't get the university to pay us for them. And I said, you're crazy. And they still gave me the job. And by the time I showed up, they'd found a way to pay people for teaching graduate courses based on a head count, but still, oh my God. With that, that began a whole new period of my life in which I had the privilege of a steady job, the pressures of tenure and so on, and the opportunity to work routinely with, on a sustained basis with graduate students.